Way, so if you can't hear, raise your hand. Bubba? All right. Um, Anytime. Minutes. So I hope you all are ready to settle in for a long winter's nap. But uh, let me just introduce Pete a little bit. Pete is a retired neurologist. He is very knowledgeable, and he'll ask you questions that you don't want to answer or you can't answer, and so to ask them. And what I'm going to ask, basically, medical school, I took a course in molecular physiology. It was taught by a Chinese man, and I sat in the front row and automatically dismiss it, at least by 11:10. I know some of you have things to do, and we've had a crisis this week in our own family, and we're going to have to leave on his hand in all of this. And I think what I really, or I'm going to say we, that I asked Pete to participate in this, but what we really want to show that there's all the reasons in the world to look at us as we are the created, and there is a creator. And by that, what I mean, there is a person, which is God, that evaluated everything, put it together. And because of my vision, Nancy did this in big font and double spaced it, and I can almost read it. But first of all, we got the integument system, and okay, thank you. All right. And we're primarily going to use the digestive system as our model and tie everything else into that. And then we have the skeletal system, quick skeletal bone. How many bones are there in the body? 12. Okay. Well, it doesn't make a bit of difference. I'm not embarrassed, Howard. Okay. He probably knows, but if you'd asked me, I couldn't have told you. There's 207. Unless you have an extra coxswain. Okay. And then, of course, we have the circulatory system every time we share, because you'll talk about somebody had cancer and they had positive nodes or negative nodes. We hope to try to explain to you the function that has in all of this. We got Pete here because in the process of development of the GI system, the nervous system plays an extremely important role. See, I knew he couldn't keep quiet. And deal with that as well too. The digestive system itself, from the top to the end, the reproductive system, and I have run this by my sensors, so I'm going to be limited in some of the things I was going to say. Our environment that we live in, when you consider the vegetation, the water, the soil, and even going into the universe. And I think it was a couple of weeks ago I was talking a little bit about this with Harry, and I was going through just the human part about the digestive system, and he said, well, you really got to think about all these other things. Let's talk about gravity for a minute. Without gravity, in the Earth itself, as you know, sits on an axis. You know that it revolves. And if you throw that off the axis, it's going to be a disaster. Yes, we can fly to the moon. Yeah, we have flown to the moon. We can fly to Mars. And there's a lot of similarities that Mars have. Happened to wear a suit from the excessive heats and the excessive low temperatures that are not compatible with life and live in a bubble. Yeah, and Pete is saying the lack of oxygen being the primary. And while we're talking about that the body needs to, in the vicinity of 20%, has to be oxygen. The big bulk of what we breathe is nitrogen. And you all know about CO2. and there's 1% or less. The other fractions of a percentage really consist of inert gases, helium, and so forth. This person, and I think it's interesting if you look in the Genesis as to how all this was developed, that the very last thing that God created was humans. And we'll look at the heavens, that we could not exist without the role of the sun, and we certainly could not exist without the effect that the sun has on the moon. Yes, it provides us with light, but it also provides us with the gravity pull. And then let's just take the soil that we make life possible. But most importantly, he provided us with water, which not just only the oceans that he created, but the water for it's necessary for the nutrition system and for digestion, and the animals that can function on that. And basically, you're looking at, wow, this was planned out, not just only to make the body, but to provide it with all the things that are accessible to us to go on and to live. And then just briefly, I've taken some course in life science, that a basic cell is a fascinating piece of organism, that it has most cells that you're going to look at are going to look around like this. In the center of it is a nucleus, and inside the nucleus is the genetic material that determines everything that which is the gelatin-like material that surrounds the cell. There's mitochondria in there, and each one of those cells is really basically should be looked at as its own independent engine, because it is big. And the cells themselves, so something's got to hold these cells together. And what do you hold all these cells together? And it's gluten. And we have the squamous cells. And in going through this digestive system, I'm going to explain a little bit about the cells changing in different parts of the body. You've got nervous cells, which look entirely different than the kind of cells that cover your skin. And the most common one that you're familiar with, because I've heard you all use it, is squamous cells. And it's not squamous, but say it however you want to, because you don't know any better. But these are squamous cells, and they not only cover the skin, they're also insides playing a role in our bodies. And then we got columnar cells, and columnar cells look like a column, and they're serving different functions. That some of these will secrete enzymes, and there's some these columnar cells that have little hair-like structures on the top of them. Those are called ciliated columnar cells, and they sort of help processes, the whole digestive procedure on. And fat cells are entirely different. Most of us can identify with those too. And then you get into the other cells. You get in the urinary tract, you got transitional cells. And the bladder, urinary bladder, is consisted of a mucosa, which is the lining of the bladder. And this is where you find the transitional cells. And the transitional cells, well, the bladder itself is a muscle. But these transitional cells, the main function that they have is that they can expand. So just imagine the bladder expands as it becomes full of urine. So it's got to be able to expand as well too. And then we also have different kinds of muscles, muscle cells. They're striated cells, and those are the kind of cells that you'll see in the muscles of your arm or wherever. And you have non-striated muscle cells, which you're going to see in the muscles that, for example, are involved in the process of peristalsis, which is a process that the body is doing to push on what we ingest as food, is to push it on to the next section. And I think I mentioned the nerve cells, and Pete can go into that more than what I can. And
Nerve cells are very, very important.
see, I knew he'd get his part in. It's coming, Pete. Well, in fact, pretty soon I'll let him take over that part. And we got all kinds of muscles in your body that I am willing to bet that most of you don't even know exist. And I did some of you have the answer, so please keep quiet, of you that know the answer. But what is the most interesting muscle in the body? Tongue, that's a good answer, but it's not the right one. Heart, good answer, but not the right one. Huh? Eye. Well, the eye muscles, you mean? Right? Yeah, because the eye is not a muscle. Okay. Okay, very good. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. A woman's mouth. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Larry is getting very close to the answer. And my response is, you can say I'm wrong, but it's the anal sphincter. That is the only muscle that I know of. And it's a muscle, it's not a nerve, but it can distinguish between liquid, solid, and gas.
Sometimes not in the right order.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me have in part of the and what we're going to do very shortly here is to follow food that we take in, and it goes through the whole digestive system until it finally comes down to the rectum. So, Pete, if you want to explain what I kept you from talking about a minute ago, and also the role of the vagus nerve in all of this digestive. And then we'll come, after he finishes with that, we're going to come back with the trip down the alimentary canal.
I didn't have a total understanding of what we were going to be talking about this morning. But these are very, very complex systems. And Bob has alluded to that. And until you really spend a little time with it, and it took me 5 years of studying the nervous system just to graduate with a degree in neurology, and another 40 years to really learn how it worked. So this is not something we're going to be able to tell you about in a day. But the significant thing is that, for, at least as far as the nervous system goes, is the nervous system does not tolerate many mistakes. If you don't constitute the nervous system properly from the beginning to the end, it's going to show up as some kind of abnormality. We can get by with different changes in hair colors, skin types, muscle mass. All of this allows a little latitude. But the nervous system has no latitude. And that's why it's always affected more by drugs that are used while you're in utero. It's more affected by trauma. it has less ability to replace itself. So that having been said, I thought we were going to be talking mainly about the GI tract, so that's what I prepared for. But I'm going to send you a wiring diagram around, and it's important to understand the complexity of this because, we take all this stuff for granted. The autonomic or the automatic nervous system does 95% of the work that you do in a day. So I'm going to send you a wiring diagram so you can see the complexity of it, and this is a simplified diagram, and just pass it around and take a look at it. And then I'm going to talk about it a little bit.
Do you understand what he's talking about when he says autonomic nervous system?
I am going to explain that.
Okay. Love you, brother.
Yes. Okay. The autonomic nervous system. Most medical students don't like neurology, and the reason is it involves a whole lot of this complex stuff that nobody really wants to know about and would like to assume that it just takes care of itself, but it doesn't. So what is the autonomic nervous system? Anybody familiar with sympathetic nervous system, what it might do? How about fight or flight? Everybody familiar with that? Yeah. All right, fight or flight is a mechanism that basically gets you ready to either run or to fight. So basically the sympathetic nervous system is a system that's going to make you do things. It makes you do things. So it's an actor. The parasympathetic is another system that sort of balances off what it does. And I'll give you some specific examples in a minute. It's designed to kind of balance off the effects of the sympathetic system. So have you ever heard of the term homeostasis? It's where you want to be. You want your body in perfect balance, so that's homeostasis. So there's a constant balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So just to kind of give you an idea, in the digestive system, the parasympathetic system increases peristalsis. That's the contractions of the smooth muscle in the GI tract. Bob's going to talk about that a little bit more. And it also makes the digestive glands in the GI tract work. Now, the sympathetic decreases the activity. So if you're getting ready to get in a fight, you don't really want to be emptying your bowels. You want to be tightening things up. So the parasympathetic has no effect on the liver, but the sympathetic does because it, in response to the fight or flight program, has the liver release stored glycogen, which is turned into glucose that provides you immediate energy. Makes sense, right? You need it. In the lungs, parasympathetic constricts the bronchioles when you're at rest. The sympathetic then dilates the bronchioles so that if you're getting ready to run, you open up your airways, you can get more oxygen in to have the muscles work properly. It has no effect on the kidneys, except the sympathetic will decrease urine output, which is, again, another thing you want to be doing if you're running. The parasympathetic decreases heart rate. The sympathetic increases heart rate. Again, that's kind of a balance. And you've all had the effect of being frightened, and that's sympathetic, and your heart rate races, right? Have you ever gotten really nauseated? And if you'll do something what we call when you get nauseated because of the stimulation of the vagus nerve, you begin to what we call brady down. You slow your heart rate down. So nausea will trigger this vagal response, which is parasympathetic, which causes your heart rate to go down. And if you happen to be standing up, it's not a good thing. That produces something that we call vasovagal syncope. So the blood vessels dilate. If you're standing up, you pass out. Does anybody know why they changed the design on phone boxes?
On what?
Phone boxes.
Song boxes.
Phone.
Phone boxes.
Phone booths, right?
Oh.
Okay. Used to be you'd get in a phone booth and you'd shut the door, and you had to pull it back in from the inside. So you happen to be on the phone, you get bad news, you have the vasovagal reflex, you faint in the phone booth, and if you happen to be a substantial size, nobody could get in to rescue. If you stay in the upright position, so you stay up, you don't get flat on the floor, then oftentimes it was fatal. So they had to change the design of the box. So now they fall out instead of fall in, if you can find the phone box. Right. So anyway, that's just sort of a practical application.
Yeah,
What-
let me just,
Sure.
yeah, I got a practical application for that one. That if, as Pete said, you do want to lie flat, and practically speaking, the heart is one, it's delivering the blood to your brain, and the heart can pump blood this way a lot easier than it can pump it up. So if you get in a recumbent position, you've made it easier in the heart. And also elevating your feet, because that helps increase the blood flow. Is that correct?
Yes. The yeah, if you, and just as a, you've been in church and had somebody faint in church.
Chuck, Roman Chuck.
Yeah. Sometimes people of goodwill want to get you up and get you moving, right? Let me ask you that if somebody faints, you do not get them up. It takes 10 to 15 minutes for this process to stop and to reverse. So if you stand them up, you just start it all over again. So what you want to do is if somebody passes out, you can assess them on the ground. You don't have to get them up. Just let them stay flat. If you want to do good Boy Scout, you elevate the legs. That just returns blood flow. The heart can pump it, it's 70 as long as you're flat. But if you're elevated, 70 is not going to perfuse your brain. I happen to think the brain is the most important organ in the body, and you just don't function without it. I mean, your heart can go on forever, well, as long as it's programmed to, but you just don't go on without your brain. So, dizziness is two forms. Dizziness can come from the middle ear, and has anybody ever had labyrinthitis, dizziness, middle ear? In your middle ear is a series of canals. One is horizontal, one is vertical to that, and the other one is at right angles to that. So it detects motion in all directions. So if your head goes forward and back, with your eyes closed, you can tell where your head is, basically. You can tell whether you're turning left or you're turning right. That's all from the middle ear. If that gets overstimulated, if I put warm water in your ear, it's going to make you think you're turning to the right. If I put cold water in your ear, which turns the currents the other way, it'll make you think you're going left. So if you get an inflammation in your middle ear, then it's going to produce this violent vertigo. That's what most people would associate dizziness with. The second cause of dizziness would be drop in blood pressure, in which you begin to feel lightheaded, which is the usual type. And so then if you don't sit down or you don't find the cause of the drop in blood pressure, then you can pass on out. Right? Correct. Adrenaline is sympathetic. It's produced by the adrenal gland, and so when you start one of these fight or flight mechanisms, the automatic nervous system sends a nerve, and you'll see it somewhere on that diagram, that goes directly to the adrenal medulla, which sits on top of the kidney, which releases adrenaline, which is a sympathetic, meaning it mimics the sympathetic nervous system. So it raises your blood pressure, constricts blood vessels. So if you're going to get in a knife or sword fight, you want your blood vessels constricted as much as you can. You tend to bleed less. In case anybody's planning a knife fight. Does that answer that question? Okay. All right. I got a few more things, Bob.
Okay.
That'll get you into your alimentary canal. We said that parasympathetic doesn't really affect blood vessels, but sympathetic does constrict them, and that makes sense. You want to protect that. The parasympathetic causes your eyes to water. It lets your salivary glands provide liquid in your mouth so you don't have a dry mouth. Whereas with sympathetic input from the sympathetic nervous system, it causes your mouth to get dry because you stop secreting from all of those glands. And your eyes get dry, actually. And then, interestingly enough, the pupil dilates when you have a sympathetic discharge. And that's designed to get you see the most light you can see, the greatest distance so you can pick up danger. It's just automatically done for you. You don't even have to think about it. It just happens. Yes, sir.
Overcoming of the dry mouth? What's the balance there?
Well, there are a number of conditions that do produce dry mouth, so you have to, as we get older, unfortunately, sometimes the salivary glands change a little bit. Some of the drugs that we use will increase that problem, especially if you drugs like the antihistamines are bad to dry out your mouth a little bit.
It's an old Indian thing, is things they were telling the truth about. They would have a hot knife, put it on your tongue. If it sizzled, you were okay. If you burned it, you were lying.
Do you understand how that works? Well, I'll tell you how that works. All right. If you have nothing to fear, you're going to be relaxed and you're going to be salivating. So you'll be making normal saliva. If you're afraid and you've done it, there are a lot of societies that do this particular trick. Well, it's interesting. If in your culture, and there are a lot of tribes in Africa and in places in India where they do this, if you believe that you're innocent, and you know that you're innocent, then you've seen this happen a number of times. So your response will be not to burn. And most people confess before they ever get the hot knife put up. Yeah. Okay. Almost through, Bob. And then sympathetic stimulates sweat glands, the adrenal medulla, and we talked about how the parasympathetic constricts the pupil. Why would you want to constrict your pupil? Yeah, but what's the most important function we do with our eyes? We probably read or look, right? So for close vision, you have to constrict the pupil to see what so that's designed for close vision. Probably became more prominent as we began to read and got better developed. All right, let's see if I got anything else to add to this. Caffeine's good for you, especially if it's an espresso. That's true. Can I digress on that a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, this is part of your digestive tract. Is anybody afraid of drinking coffee? Okay.
I'm afraid I'll run out.
Yeah, that's good. If you're a chronic coffee drinker and you drink regular coffee, it has benefits. If you're a sporadic coffee drinker and you insist on decaf, then you get none of the benefits and you get a lot of side effects. So I'm not sure why we even have decaf coffee.
I'd like it.
For what reason?
I like the taste.
No, not if you're a regular coffee drinker. Yeah. Yes. 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 What are you on for your atrial fibrillation? That's sort of been routine. You probably don't know this, but there have probably been 50 studies to prove. They started out with the premise that caffeine and coffee were bad for you. That's never been the case. Now, if you're particularly sensitive with atrial fibrillation and you're taking none of the medicines to control it, then small amounts of caffeine might stimulate it. But the benefits of caffeine really, really outweigh. You're more likely to get in trouble with a small amount of alcohol than you are with coffee. Because even tiny bits of alcohol in people who have atrial fibrillation can set the whole process off. And it has nothing to do with the amount, it just has to do with the effect of alcohol on the heart. So, yes.
What's the best way to keep our neurological system healthy?
Read a lot, exercise your brain, it's because it is. Coffee is very good for you. Yeah, actually. That's more for the GI tract. It has more GI benefits than it does. People who regularly drink coffee have a lower incidence of colon cancer, and it may have to do because of the mobility of the GI tract with coffee. And like I say, 50 studies to prove that it was bad for you had just the opposite effect. You're more likely to get in trouble with decaffeinated than you are with caffeine.
In addition to the reading and working on
Physical exercise helps. Stay as flexible as you can, because as we get older, we tend to lose flexibility. Unless you started yoga at a very young age, you don't want to do that you don't want to take up yoga late. Yoga was always good for my business. I got probably 6 or 7 cervical disc ruptures and a lot of so I shouldn't. And then late in my practice, y'all heard something called hot yoga? Oh yeah. Y'all familiar with that? That's incredible. I mean, you put yourself in a room of 110 degrees, you start exercising, and then they work to the point of prostration. And I can't tell you how many heat prostrations and several heat strokes I've treated that came out of the hot yoga rooms. And it makes, and it's like people, I'm not going to step any toes here, but if you insist on running marathons to get that runner's high, that's kind of what you do with the hot yoga, then you're going to pay a real price for that. Your body does not like that. I mean, we got people on the news telling us, not to go outside because it's 90 degrees, like it's never been 90 degrees, right? Nobody grew up without air conditioning. Unfortunately, I did. That's an interesting question. It really is an interesting question. Balance.
Let me just pause for that for a little bit. It's a good question. I want to hear it myself, but I got to get a little GI in.
Well,
we'll come
I
back
can do
to it.
balance real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, that is an important question.
Yeah.
To improve balance, you have to do things that improve your balance. So you have to make yourself do things that balance. Like, do you play golf? All right. Practice your balance in golf. You're going to get a benefit from doing the practice swing, but if you fully turn this way and then you fully turn this way and you stay in balance, you're going to have a better golf swing and you're going to improve your. So if you want to, I'm going to publish this, I think. Hold this a minute. You want to stimulate all the levers. So you're going to need to end up spending a little time down here. Then you come back up. That stimulates your horizontal lever. So you want to turn as far as you can go this way. Turn as far as you can go this way. And then you want to put your head back. Now that's going to stimulate your back. Then if you add to that walking, then you're going to do everything you need to do to improve balance. But you got to use it. It's like your brain. If you don't use your balance, you're going to lose your balance.
What about standing on one foot?
If you want to. It's good. It's a good. Whatever you can do to make it work. But do practical things that you're going to do every day. I think that was a part of a standardized test in Florida. Could you stand on one foot with your other foot on your knee and your arms out and your eyes closed? That was a standard test. But yeah, anything you can do that you feel like improving.
How about touching your nose and walking a straight line?
How many times have you been involved in this? Always after
All
dark.
right, alcohol disinhibits the cerebellum, which is responsible for your balance, and I wouldn't recommend doing that.
What's known about the start prevention?
Okay, hold that, Grady. Yeah, let me just say that I wasn't real sure that we would need to go into the second one, which would be next week, and it seems obvious to me with the questions that probably that we should. And I really wanted this to be more than just an anatomy and physiology listen. But I do think when we can establish what the normalcy is in all these different systems, and then I think it's appropriate. And because this is Sunday school, and I really want to make a spiritual application, but if it's all right with John and Carl, that we will, or at least I will come back and try to answer some of these questions that have come. And I know that I myself, if I were sitting there and all this is going on, but something's not going right and I don't understand it, why? And why, I think, is a good question. So if that's all right with you, then I can safely say, because what I would like to do then the next time is try to get through the pulmonary and the cardiorespiratory system, which was going to have to be very, very brief because I also want us to understand how all these other systems are in here. And basically, we are not sitting here trying to make a case against evolution. You listen to evolution, and you can make your own take on it. For my own self, all I have to do is look at what we're discussing and look what they're trying to say, just develop this way, and it doesn't make any sense. But I think what we have to look at, God in his infinite wisdom and knew how to do this. And this is such a good system. He also used these same systems in every animal form that is existent. And even when you go down into the insects and you can do this even as a simple thing as a worm. So basically, God created something wonderful, and he put all these systems together, and he was thinking ahead. He had to be a great chess player because, if I do this, I've got to do this. And I sort of compare it with doing woodworking. If I want to do this to that, I got to plan way back in the beginning, so they're all compatible with each other. And all these systems are compatible. That takes intelligent design, and that's really what I wanted to emphasize. And I just briefly want to get finish the digestive tract, and we've got enough time to do that.
He drafted me for 2 weeks.
Yes, I did.
You're breathtaking. Body and soul, I am marvelously made. I worship in adoration. What a creation. You know me inside and out. You know every bone in my body. You know exactly how I was made, bit by bit. How I was sculptured from nothing into something. Like an open book, you watched me grow from conception to birth. All the stages of my life were spread out before you. The days of my life all prepared before I even lived one day.
Thank you. Basically, that's saying everything that we're trying to say. Okay, quick.
Psalm 139, I started in verse 13 to 16.
Okay. Basically, we're going to take a diarrhea approach to the GI tract. And so whatever the food that we take, it comes into our mouth, obviously. And then the different muscle systems kick in. First of all, what happens once that food gets in your mouth? Chew it, right. Okay, and saliva forms. Okay, the three systems are operating at the same time then. The integument, and the tegument is contributing the teeth. And in the teeth, as you know, these are so you can grasp it. The incisors are so you can tear it. And then your molars are so that you can masticate it. So we've got and what do the teeth sit in? Bone, right. Okay, so bone system is there. And then the tongue is a muscle, and it's moving everything around. And you probably did this experiment when you were in grade school, that a teacher would give you a piece of bread and just put it in your mouth and hold it. What happened if you held it in your mouth? Huh? I can't hear you. Soggy, but it also turns into sugar. And the purpose of, okay, and then the muscular system, what are the muscles involved in, beside the tongue, involved in chewing? Huh? Okay, the cheek, these muscles here. And then once that food goes in, you can take the whole thing and call it the pharynx, Pharynx. And there's and at the top part of the pharynx is a bone that goes 2/3 of the way back to the posterior, and it's called the hard palate. And then the last part of it is called the soft palate. And that's bone again too. So what is that performing? What's the reason for the palate? Huh?
Always thought it was for taste, but I don't know.
No. The part of the chief role of the pharynx is that if you didn't have the palate there, this food would go above the palate into your nostrils, and every food would be going into the respiratory system. And then the tongue is. Are you doing this because I'm not holding it up, or are you just itching? Okay, thank you. This better. All right, and the tongue and these muscles are pushing everything to the back, and we've got the palate there to make sure the solids don't get into the respiratory. We got another problem that would occur, that the thing that your Adam's apple that you can feel is the top of the trachea. That's where the air comes in. And what happens when the food gets in the posterior pharynx and you got the trachea back there? Huh? But why don't we choke? Because we don't. Huh? Swallow is right, but there's a little flap. It's called the epiglottis, and it closes the trachea off so the food can pass on. And, you talk about multitasking. Most of us can talk, we can eat, we can breathe, all at the same time without any of this having us to give any part to. Once it gets into the, down to that part, it comes into the esophagus. And the esophagus runs from the back of the mouth down into the stomach. And the esophagus has longitudinal muscles. And you all know when I say by peristalsis, this is a muscle contracting down. So it's trying to push everything down forward in the GI tract. So once the esophagus enters into the diaphragm, things change again. The same kind of cells, these are squamous cells, and the cells in the esophagus are also squamous cells. And when you get to the diaphragm consists of two muscle leaves, and they're big one. They separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. When you take a deep breath, the diaphragm goes down, and when you expire, it decompresses. And there's a problem because the two leaves of the diaphragm, come together like this. And this opening in here is where the esophagus and the aorta, the vena cava, lymphatic system, and nervous system is going through there. So this has to be fairly tight. If it's not tight, what happens? You all have experienced it. Huh? You get reflux. And reflux is because the stomach is able to herniate up through here. And when it does, it's lined with columnar cells. And the columnar cells are putting out gastric juices and some different enzymes. It has hydrochloric acid in it. And if that regurgitates into the esophagus, it causes scarring. And that's, and then you get what is called heartburn. It really isn't heartburn, but it's just the reflux that is causing the pain. And then in the stomach looks like a big balloon. It's got and it's usually takes 3 or 4 hours. So it's going to turn the food over and try to break this up. And it has all the enzymes and so forth and gastric juices that are working to accomplish that. Then the stomach is pushing all this food to the last part of the stomach, and that comes into what is called the pylorus, which is about this long and a circular like this. And a circular like this because it squeezes down so that food from the stomach cannot get into the next part, which is the small intestine. And so the big curvature in the stomach is the area that's more prone to develop ulcers, and also the pylorus. And there was an operation, it's still used, but it was used more. And no, and this was basically, you'd see this in little boys where they'd have projectile vomiting, and all they had to do was cut the muscle this way and sew it back this together, which widened it, and then everything could go into the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. And that becomes interesting too, because the duodenum is only about 6 to 8 inches long. You've got 9 feet. You got 9 feet of colon, and you got 16 feet of small intestine. So from the stomach into the small intestine, and the first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum, and then there's a duct that comes into what's called the ampulla of water, which is just a little rise, and that's where all the juices that are necessary for digestion come in. And these juices are coming down in what is called the common bile duct, which is fed by the hepatic duct, which is coming from the liver, and the liver is producing bile and the different enzymes that are necessary for metabolism. Yeah, right. And no, the liver is basically a storage. And when Pete talked before, is that the liver picks up the glucose, changes it to glycogen. Glycogen is a storage, and when the body needs sugar that Pete talked to. Okay, it's sort of hard to wave your hands and do that at the same time. But anyhow, the glycogen turns to sugar, which is necessary for the flight part. And the pancreas duct comes in at the same place. And also the gallbladder is used to store the bile, and the bile comes in that too. And I just think it's fascinating how all these things are working together. And so the next part of the trip is to go through the 16 feet of small bowel. And the small bowel is composed of columnar tissue, and it will have those little cilia, and this is where all the enzymes and the in the take-up of the nutrition, also getting rid of what they don't want that is liquid and can be used in metabolism, and the rest of it remains as waste material. And so during the 16 feet of small intestines, the body is waste is mostly in a liquid form. So this continues on until it comes into the jejunum. That's the biggest part of the intestine, and it goes shooting straight down here and meets the colon. The colon comes across here, and at the end of this junction is a little organ. My finger represents an appendix, and from that point on, you start the trek through the colon, and the purpose of the colon is to take as much of the fluid out and reduce it to a not and thank you. I was working my way around other words and I couldn't come up with it. I appreciate it. So anyhow, then the colon sends all this waste material up here. This is called the hepatic flexure, and it goes across the transverse, and then this is a splenic one over here because the spleen sits here, and it sends it down until it comes into the rectum, and your appendix generally is on the right side, and once in a while it occurs on the left side, but when that happens, that's called situs inversus, and this part is turned around, and your heart, instead of being on this side, is over on this side. That happens during the embryological development. And then this takes us all into the rectum, and then from that point on, when it's time to get rid of this waste material, that's when the sphincter comes into use and determines.
Purpose of the rectum.
Huh?
What's the purpose of the rectum? It's to absorb water.
Yeah.
It's for water balance.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, that's lost in translation.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Pete to speak just briefly about this, because I think this is fascinating. That those of you who have done any running, most runners get to where they actually have diarrhea because of the running. But there's another thing that happens, all of us are not runners, and it's called the gastrocolic reflex. And that is once that you've eaten the food, and it started its way through the digestive system, there's a reflex, it's called the gastrocolic reflex. And all this means to the GI tract is, okay, more's coming, we got to make room for it and move on. And you go ahead and explain that, Pete. I leave him the dirty part.
Yeah. Now, the gastrocolic reflex, you can see how wonderful the autonomic nervous system, how important it is, and it's the main operator in all of these systems. Right, Bob?
Correct, Pete.
Right. So anyway, it's all done automatically. Just in the swallowing part, the upper third of the esophagus is voluntary. The lower 2/3 are involuntary, and that's where the autonomic nervous system takes over. As far as the gastrocolic reflex, it's probably twofold. Initially, it has to do with distension of the stomach. Distension of the stomach creates this automatic reflex, which causes you to evacuate. Certain foods in the stomach also contribute to that. There's sort of some neurotrophic hormones that take place. So anyway, it's a very common reflex. Works pretty good. And one more thing. Frequency. In my practice, perhaps the biggest neurological question I got or used to get regularly is, How often should I go to the bathroom? Anybody have an answer? Whenever you need to go. That's right. Thank you.
I'll add a little humor to that one. When I was an intern at a hospital in San Francisco, I got called one night to go to the emergency room. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was sleeping wonderfully. And so I went down there to see this man, and I said, "What's your problem?" He said, "Constipation." And so I said, "When was the last time you had a bowel movement?" And he said, "About 4 hours ago." And I said, "How about that?" And he says, "I usually go 5 or 6 times a day, but I've only had it twice today." And I said, "I think I really need to examine this thoroughly. If that guy is still alive, he still remembers my rectal exam." I think I got up to here. But anyhow, we're gonna head and conclude this, and if this is agreeable with you, I really want to tie in the other systems all into it. We won't go into as much detail. I just really want us to go away with the fact that there's an awful lot going on, and it's all working together and going smoothly. And to me, it just affirms in my mind there is only one way that we came to where we are, and that was because God created us in this way, and He did a perfect job.